So, yesterday we started by introducing the topic of Gemara. I wanted to answer two questions, which is, what is the Talmud and why we learn it? We did give an answer on some level, but I think perhaps not an entirely satisfying answer. Because what we really said was that Talmud is an abstract concept. It's a way, it means thinking about the material, the Torah Sheba'al Peh in particular. And actually the Rambam defined very specific ways of thinking about it, as deduction, getting underlying principles, extrapolation, to understand implications, to compare and contrast, and finally to use Yud Gimel Midos, which is a special decoder ring that Hashem gave to unlock the code of the Torah. I wouldn't call it logic, but it's Talmud's logic. It's decoder ring. It's how it was encoded. And to apply that kind of thinking to the Divrei Yeshua, to the oral tradition, to the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So that didn't actually answer the question which you would want to probably get answered when you ask, what is the Talmud? Because you're thinking about this book on the shelf, this very large book on the shelf. So we still need to explore that. And as far as why we learn it, we also didn't really give such a thoroughly gratifying answer. We basically said, we learn it because the Rabbi said we ought to learn it, and we learned a drasha based on the Shinantam. We shouldn't read it as Shinantam, but rather the Shilashtam. You should divide it into thirds. A third of your time of learning should be dedicated to learning this abstract thing called Talmud. But again, that's probably not what you mean. When you ask why we learn Talmud, you probably mean not because the Rabbi said so. You mean, what am I supposed to get out of it? And why is it important? Why did Hashem want us to learn, spend a third of our lives, at least, thinking about the implications and underlying principles, etc., of the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So we need to explore that a little more also. And I think also probably implicit in the question of, hey, why are we learning this? Why are we learning Talmud? I think is also another question for many, which is the Talmud certainly is written in a very circuitous, abstruse, arcane way where there's lots of dead ends and it doesn't get to the point so quickly and doesn't keep on the point very thoroughly and it's not ostensibly very well organized. It's like, why did they do this to us, whoever they are, and we have to struggle for a whole lifetime to deal with this text, which is really quite unforgiving and seemingly sort of like dealing with a lot of stuff which seems very, very irrelevant on many levels, if no other reason than we just, we say, oh, forget that, and we just throw it all out after spending a whole page working on it. We say, oh, forget that, we made a mistake, and start from scratch. Like, why don't we just, the editorial staff, cut that piece out and then get to the chase? So I think that's also a question that's pregnant in the question of why we learn Talmud. So I want to go back and dig a little deeper to answer what is Talmud and why we learn it. That is the second part of the introduction. But just to review for a moment what we did say yesterday, because we didn't say nothing, we said some very important things. We said that the Talmud is something which is a portion of Talmud Torah, of the study of Torah, which is separate from Mikra and Mishnah, separate from the Torah Sheba'al, the 24 books, as the Shulchan Aruch had explicitly defined it, and Mishnah, which is the tradition, literally the book of the Mishnah, as well as other things that are coming to explain the psukim of the Torah. We have in tradition. There's a third thing called Talmud, which is thinking about the principles that are there in Mishnah, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and thinking about them and extrapolating and building upon them and so on. That's something very significant, because the implication of that is that when the Rambam says, we'll go with the Rambam for a moment, the Rambam says you should learn, in the beginning of your learning, you should learn Mikra and Mishnah, third, but later on, you can dedicate all your time to learning Talmud, except for enough time not to forget the dinim, the rules of Mikra and Mishnah. It tells you there's a very different nature between the two. It tells you that Mikra and Mishnah, the Chumash, the scripture, capital S scripture, the Tanakh, is a finite text of only 24 books and how many pages and words there are. And the Mishnah also is finite. The principles that were given in Har Sinai, certainly according to Rambam, but it's certain to logic too, are finite, is finite, the set of principles, and they can all be mastered. And the Rambam seems to understand elsewhere that the set is not that overwhelming, so much so that the Rambam thinks that the Pashut is a given, that every Jew, not just one with IQ 160, but every Jew can, over the course of his life, and perhaps soon after he turns 13 even, master all of those dinim, all of the principles of Torah Sheba'al Peh. The Rambam famously, and he got a lot of trouble for it in his Hakdama, his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, says all you need for books is the Tanakh and my book, the Mishnah Torah, which got him in a lot of trouble. But I think if you look at the Rambam's words carefully over there, they bring the text, and what we explained yesterday, the Rambam Shita, it's not that big a deal at all. Because the Rambam is simply saying, I believe, and that's what the word Mishnah Torah means, the Rambam attempted, these are my words, but I think this is, if you consider the Rambam in his Hagdama and what we established yesterday, I think this is the only reasonable explanation. The Rambam understands that when Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Har Sinai, he was there for 40 days and 40 nights, and that's a finite amount of time, and obviously Hashem taught him whatever he had to teach him, and Moshe Rabbeinu came down with all the principles of the Torah, everything. There's a Gemara that says famously that Hashem showed Moshe Rabbeinu everything that's going to be in future generations. Every Talmud Vasik, every accomplished student will ask. Moshe saw it, but whatever Moshe saw doesn't mean what Moshe taught. What Moshe taught was a set of principles called the Torah, and they're finite. And the Rambam's understanding, I believe, when he wrote a book called the Mishnah Torah, which means the repeat of the Torah, the Rambam was attempting to reconstruct those principles that Moshe Rabbeinu came down with. To me, that's Pasha. That's what Rambam's saying. That's what Rambam has attempts to redo. And he said, this is it. This is the Mishnah Torah. This is the recap, literally, Mishnah Torah, the recap of what Moshe Rabbeinu came down with. And these are the principles. He didn't mean that the Talmud is useless, obviously. That's, to me, Pasha. He didn't mean that. He meant, in terms of texts, you have the Tanakh is always going to be there. That's holding the scripture. And you have the set of principles which they codified at some point. Originally, Torah Shabbat Peh was forbidden to be written down. It's like Gemara and Kedushin, Gittin Daf Samach, you can't write it down. But because of Eis Lasos, the necessity of the time forced them to write it down. We'll discuss more history of that in a few minutes. Torah Shabbat Peh was written down, and the Rambam attempted to rewrite it down in a very Mustudar, orderly fashion. But that doesn't obviate, that just gives you your Mikra Mishnah. That gives you your Gemara, your Talmud, which can go on forever. So that's a very important implication. There's a corollary to that also, which is that tells you that Rambam's understanding that there are funny halachas, like for example, the Gemara and Kedushin and the Rambam also posits this halacha, the Shulchan Aruch brings it, when it says, La'olam yisa isha va'achar kach, sorry, Le'olam yilma Torah va'achar kach yisa isha. The rule is, you should first learn the Torah and then get married. I'm not discussing that, so we get length here, but that's the Shulchan Aruch Paskins, that's the based on the Rambam, that's the din. Although some say, well, I don't know, when would you finish learning the Torah? When is that the green light to get married? But by the Rambam would be Pasha, right? The Rambam says, when you learn Tanakh, and you learn all the principles Moshe Rabbeinu had to say, which I will recap you in my Mishnah Torah, or you can learn whatever it is, Mishnah and the other accompanying texts, it's a finite set of rules. And his Rambam's lashon was, review them so you don't forget any of the dinim, any of the rules. And then you can have a whole lifetime, once you're married, Talmud, thinking about those principles goes on forever. So that we did establish by the Rambam. The Rabbeinu Tam had a different approach altogether, if you will. Rabbeinu Tam, the Gemara had said he has divided time into thirds, Mikra, Mishnah, and Talmud. Rabbeinu Tam said, well, nowadays we rely on this Gemara and Sanhedrin that Bavli, Talmud Bavli is a mixture of everything, combines it all. I kept on saying, like in an undertone, that I suspect strongly that the Rabbeinu Tam is attempting to give a limit schus, to give a justification for the custom of people dedicating a lot of time to Talmud without having mastered Mikra and Mishnah first. I don't believe that's clean off the shot it's not the intention of the text that we learned in Kedushin yesterday for sure. And I find it very hard to believe that the Rabbeinu Tam meant it as l'chachila. First of all, everyone brings the drisha. The drisha is brought, I showed you yesterday, brought by all the Nosei Kelman Shulchan Aruch. It's not proper, so I can just say that's it. Despite the Ramah we saw yesterday. But more than that, if you look, the whole sugya, if you remember from yesterday, the sugya was exact third. So much so that the Gemara was like a third of your life, oh how will you know, and then a third of your, Rashi said a third of your week. Right? Sunday, Monday, Mikra, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Mishnah and so on. And the Tosafos is like, well, maybe you'll die midweek. So you see they want a very exacting measure of third. If that's the case, I find it very hard to believe that Rabbeinu Tam believed that Talmud Bavli is such a perfect mixture of Mikra, Mishnah, and Talmud that you have a third in that mixture. That's obviously absurd, and if you learn one block of Gemara, you see it's not divided third Mikra, third Mishnah, third Gemara. So I suspect that it's a limit schus, and not l'chachila. Either way, the Shulchan Aruch passed what it did. And the bottom line then is that the Rabbeinu Tam is saying that the way of the world is that we do spend a lot of time learning Talmud. But the Talmud we learn is the Talmud, Dafka Talmud Bavli, which is a little thing of Talmud. Think about it for a second. When the Gemara in Kedushin said the third, it didn't think of Bavli because the Talmud Bavli had been written at that time. The Talmud said it. It didn't mean that at the time. It's something ex post facto. In any case, that's what we said yesterday. So we said something. Now I want to take a step deeper to discuss what not just Talmud is, this kind of thinking about the Torah Sheba'al Peh, but also the Talmud, the text we have in front of us, or will have us. But by tomorrow, we will all have our own texts of the Talmud, brachas, in front of us. Some of you should please bring a paper version of the Talmud, brachas, so you can write it in notes, and a piece of paper to write down your questions. So for that, it's worth just having a brief historical reflection. Moshe came down, he had these principles, he taught them as Torah Sheba'al Peh, as an oral tradition, for something like around, and the subsequent people, something like around 1,500 years. Okay? They stayed oral. For the first 1,000 years of that time, there was also Torah Shebechsav being created. First Moshe was dictated to for 40 years in Har Sinai, and then there were Nevi'im Rishonim, Yoshua, and so on, the early prophets, and later prophets, and so on, till the scripture, the Tanakh, was signed and sealed and closed only by the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset Gedola, like around the year 500 BCE, something like that. Okay, a little later, 400 BC. It's an interesting discussion, but not for this minute. In any case, we're talking something like around close to 1,000 years after Har Sinai. Torah Sheba'al Peh, however, remains oral, persisting on. What happened was, life was tricky for the Jews during the Second Temple period, already by, you can interject, many times was difficult, but it got especially difficult under the Romans in the year 63 BCE. Judea, today called Israel, I guess, became essentially a Roman vassal state under Pompey, and things got ever worse for the Jews until culminating in 70 when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. But at that time, years leading up to the Beis Hamikdash being destroyed, the Jews were tremendously fractious people. They were very split, not just socially, which they were, Stukim and Prushim and people infighting, but also the Torah itself and its tradition had begun to become quite fractious, didn't remain perfectly intact because of its oral tradition. The Gemara says that in the time of the Zugos, those were the leaders during the first half, let's call it whatever, the first portion of the Second Temple period. Zugos, these pairs of leaders. So there was only one machlokas. There was one machlokas in the whole of Torah, which boiled down to the question of doing smicha on an animal, on Yom Tov, whatever, machlokas. But that means the rest of the Torah was machlokas free. Part of that, I should point out, if you wonder how could that possibly be, part of that is because they had a functioning Sanhedrin. And having a functioning Sanhedrin means if the sages were split in terms of how to rule on something, they could just convene a meeting, which they did convene, and they could vote. And the majority ruled. Acharab Lahatos, whatever the majority of the sages said, which is 70 plus 1, I mean, not for now, the mechanics, the majority would rule, and that would then become the established halacha. So they could unroot and disentangle any machlokas through a Sanhedrin convening. What happened was, I guess it was, this is a little speculative on my part, and speculative on everyone's part, even though they had a Sanhedrin functioning, certain things, starting with the smicha issue, became so contentious, they couldn't or didn't convene a Sanhedrin to just resolve it once and for all. I guess the people were too split, the stakes were too high, I don't know, it was too thorny an issue, they let it stand as a machlokas. They decided not to separate it, to finalize it, to prosecute it. And by the time of Hillel and Shammai, not Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, but the parents Hillel and Shammai, parents of those schools, there were already 4 machlokasim. So you see that we're counting them on one hand, 4. And there, you can look at them, there's the smicha issue, there's the issue of the chadash issue, and the issue of how much water passes the mikvah, what do you do with how far retroactive you make a woman be tummy when she's a nida, the tummy things. That's it. Those 4 things. That's all machlokasim amongst the Jewish people. Hillel and Shammai are living like, let's call it around the year 0. It actually was never year 0, but for orientation purposes, around the year 0. Whatever, 1 common year. Their students, says the Gemara, did not, those shimshu, they didn't attend to or question or deal with their Rebbeim officially to clarify things. And hundreds of machlokim emerged in the days of the students of Hillel and Shammai. This is before the Churban, before the destruction of the temple, the second temple. So in the first generations of the Common Era, to the year 50, whatever, the year 40, something like that, 30 and on, there were ever greater proliferation, spreading of machlokas. And apparently, the schools of Shammai and Hillel were so substantial and represented like almost like two separate. We know what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, "Nasa kashtei Torahs." It became like there were two separate Torahs governing the Jewish people, which was a nightmare situation. But that's what emerged. And apparently they didn't set a base, they didn't make a Sanhedrin to convene and overrule. That apparently wouldn't make sense. I guess the nation is split 60-40, let's say, for argument's sake, to just have a tyranny of the majority and have 40% of the people just overruled, despite the fact they have sound reasoning wasn't going to fly, apparently, right? It seems that Beis Shammai were in the minority, they were the 40, so to speak, but probably they were actually the greater as a whole of the thinkers. So it was like a little tricky, right? So the tricky business, and so Nasa Kashtei Toros, the Jews must have like two separate competing orthodoxies. I'm not talking about reform, two separate orthodoxies. Now, the Gemara itself says that even though they can argue about things, it's elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim. Whatever they say, both sides are both true, or I guess I should say, both are, these and those are the words of the living God. That's a good literal translation. And I think for a moment I want to address that point. If you have a machlokas, how could two people be right? So first of all, I think whether two people are right or not is an interesting topic all to itself. Maybe we'll discuss it tomorrow or another time. It's a fascinating topic. It's an interesting topic. If it means they're both right, it's a very famous. If they're right, but let's assume they are both right. That's how many the Balei Machshava, the later Dachronim, like seem to understand that they're both both right. The question is, how can, if one says mutter, one says asher, how can two people be right? Like, what is that supposed to mean? They've been telling you that in yeshiva your whole life. Like, actually, it's that shar. How's that possible? They can say opposite things. But usually, philosophy, first day of logic tells you either have P or not P. Either it's yes or no. How can P and not P both be true? It doesn't make sense. How can a proposition and the opposite, how can mutter or asher both be true? So I want to take a step back. This point is very essential to our topic of transmitting an oral tradition. Because what they're transmitting are fixed set principles. Not the implications of those principles, not the derivation of those principles, not the comparison of those principles. There's essentially a list. We have a Mishnah, but they didn't have a Mishnah, but people were keeping their own private kilu Mishnayos in their own notebooks that they learned, their Shua taught, and so on down the doros. People had private notes of the list of principles, how Torah was meant to be understood. And when you have any rules-based system, if you play chess, if you know football, if you know geometry or mathematics or chemistry or how to write a sonnet, there are rules. And in any rules-based system, you can push the rules to their limit, and sometimes it becomes ambiguous how far or where that limit is. That's true with any rules-based system. I remember when I was a kid, they had you make the call on Monday night football, because everyone knows the rules of football, but something is a little ambiguous, right? And then it's not clear which way it should go. That's true if you play a musical instrument or you play chess. It's some of this funny, you're playing chess and then there's a rule. What happens if the two kings get together and say, oh, that can't happen? They made up a new rule, it can't happen, because it's something that's the system short circuits. Truth is, there's a philosopher, 20th century philosopher, Kurt Gödel, who showed that every rules-based system is always going to have these ambiguities. You can't iron them all out. But Torah will be the same. That's the nature of logic. In any case, so if you have a finite set of rules, which is what the Torah is, it's a big set, when you start building these edifices, sometimes you end up with contradictions or paradoxes, and it's not clear where you've gone wrong. And it could be that it seems to be, the way Torah is meant to work is, you have a finite set of rules, let's say there's 1 million of them, whatever, 1,000, it's more like that, it's probably 10,000. If we go with the Rambam. In fact, I have no idea how many halachos are on the Rambam, but it's probably much closer to 10,000 than a few thousand probably. Those are your set of rules, and you can build a lot of them, but it's only and it can go on forever, but sometimes you'll lead to contradictions. There's an amazing thing. If you ever learn geometry in high school, or whatever you learn in high school, geometry. So geometry that you learn, unless you're really an advanced, is based on Euclid's work. Euclid set down 5 rules, 5 postulates, and the whole kit and caboodle of all of geometry, non-coordinate geometry, is all built on 5 rules, building and building and building and building. Take those rules, you can run with them, you can build Euclid, his books, but then there are many books after him that build these small 5 principles. So if you have 1,000 or 10,000 principles, you can build a lot of books out of these principles. But just like Euclidean geometry, if you're familiar, sometimes things are a little fuzzy. I don't know if you're familiar. If I ask you a question, this is a riddle, an old school riddle. If you have this is how the riddle went when I was told it. If you have a bear and it walks a mile due south, and then a mile due east, and then a mile due north, and it ends up in the same place where it started, what color is the bear? That was a riddle I heard. So you're thinking, wait a second. A mile south, and a mile east, and a mile north. No. I know geometry. It's not going to be in the same place where it started out. But you know what? In certain really weird scenarios, it will. Like, for example, if it's at the North Pole. Because Euclid was thinking, in a flat world, these rules apply. But if the surface that you're dealing with is a sphere, is a curved surface, then things get a little wacky. And in Taka, if you look at it, think of it on a map, you go from the North Pole, a mile south, and a mile east, and a mile north again, you'll end up back at the North Pole again. So the answer to the riddle is that bear is white, it's a polar bear. But the point is, it's ambiguous, right? See, so you're thinking the rules of geometry is really simple, but then there's a what if. Well, what if you're on a sphere, and then the rules still kick in? And you can, for argument's sake, say Machlokas, well, that doesn't count, or it's relevant or irrelevant, or everything's a sphere anyways. So sometimes applying rules leads to ambiguity. That's the nature of any rules-based system, and the Torah is the same way. So what seems to have happened is they had 10,000 rules to work with, plus they had these middles, Torah the Dreshes band. They have another way you can actually add more rules to the game by using drushes, but not for now really, but they're there. So the rules can actually proliferate also, and then you can build these very complex edifices of thinking, as the Talmud we have does, which can lead sometimes to contradictory results. And the Torah seems to say that both can be true. Both can be true. Both elu ve'elu, both results are divrei Elokim Chaim, and that's the Torah allows for that. The Torah allows for something that's more complex than simply this binary true or false, either is or isn't. Because the Torah is something that's more, the Torah, so to speak, is true both on flat surfaces, so to speak, and also on spheres. Euclidean geometry only works on flat surfaces. The Torah is bigger than that. It can work in 3 dimensions, actually 2 dimensions, and so on. So, I'll give you just an example. Let's say Hillel and Shammai are building a building, and they learn their Euclidean geometry, learn their Pythagoras, and they are told, we have to build a base of midrash here, and this one wall is 5 almost, and one wall is 12 almost. So how many almost should the diagonal be? Because you remember your old Pythagorean theorem here?
Yeah. A squared plus b squared.
That's right. So work here. Which side is the mic on? This side? You want to know? iPhone 6 or this will ring a bell hopefully. This is 5 and this is 12. So how long is the corner wall? So the answer
13.
The answer is, right? 5 squared. It's 5 squared plus 12 squared equals. It equals whatever this is. C squared, I'll call it. Right? Add it up, you get 169 over here. So C squared equals 169. C equals square root of 169. With me? Fine. So I'll ask you a question now. You and Hillel and Shammai. Let me take a step back here. You tell me what's going on. I had an eraser, but it's not. Word eraser.
Is it napkin on top?
I'll take a napkin. Okay, so if I ask you in the abstract, I say, pop quiz, Beis Hillel by Shammai. Here's the question for today's Gemara Shir. Our question is, what is the square root of 169? So all the blood. I think that's a good number. Thank you very much. What is the square root of 169? So everyone puts up their hand and says the answer is 13. And there's this annoying kid in the back who's smarter than all of you. He's from Beis Shammai. He says, oh no it isn't. No it isn't. It's negative 13. It's negative 13. So who's right? Right?
Everybody.
There are multiple solutions to certain problems. Because this is a symbolic system, the rules of the game for how math works, square root of 169 is there are two solutions, two legitimate solutions. And not one is no way better than the other. However, obviously if you're building a base of midrash and all other plans are using positive coordinates, the house will fall on in on you if you decide to be clever and put in a negative 13 as one of your measurements, obviously, right? So I think that's what's happening when it means Elu ve'elu means if you build up this edifice of principles, you can come with even negative 13 and 13 are kind of like P and not P, right? They're opposites, they're exact opposites, so numbers of opposites. And they're both legit, they're both totally true. And the system that Beis Shammai built up was, by analogy to speak, in the negative coordinates, negative numbers, and Beis Hillel were different with the positive numbers. And there were these two conflicting, opposite, but totally logically sound, legitimate systems. Legitimate, sound systems that are not violating any rules of the Torah. And they're coming up in opposite directions. They're coming up like Nasek Shtei Toros, so to speak. Don't think this overly, it's just metaphorical, obviously, but it's a good way to start thinking about it. That you can actually build on rules and come to contradictory solutions. And that's what happened. That's what happened. By the time the Beis Mikdash is destroyed, in the year 70, you have Nasek Shtei Toros. You have two major schools. I don't know, it's hard to speak anything now as we got today, but in a world, a small world they live in a small world without telephones, and basically all the Talmud Chacham essentially were either of, team A or team B, Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai, and then pretty much everyone else in Am Haaretz, loosely speaking, and didn't count for anything in terms of their opinion. So you have like these two competing schools, and it's like the Jews are divided. People were divided, the legions, some were from the Beis Shammai team, some from the Beis Hillel team. And when the Beis Mikdash was destroyed, so the Torah continued on, but you have a double problem now. You have Jews are being dispersed. Life is terrible for the Jews under the Romans after the destruction. Our Beis Mikdash is gone, so people have lost sort of hope and will to live, and they start wondering. Many Jews wondered and became Christians. Like, obviously, we were wrong, God's punishing us, that's why he took the temple away. That was the Christians' early argument. You see, God's abandoned you, you were wrong, and so on and so forth. So Rabbi Gamliel, who was the head of the Jews, the head of the Sanhedrin, if you know your details exactly, Yochanan ben Zakkai, for a very brief time, was at least the Hillel students, but he was very briefly the Nasi, but he handed over the reins to Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel, who we'll meet early in the Science of Brachos, said, like, the end. I'm not having any more two schools, no Hillel and Beis Shammai. Famously, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua were the two greatest of his. He set up, Jerusalem's gone, but Yavna, he kept Yavna, Rabbi Gamliel kept Yavna, and so on. And the two greatest, which wasn't Rabbi Gamliel, he just had the Yichus as a great Rabbi Gamliel was a great grandson, I think, of Hillel, right? In the chain of Nisim. So, but he wasn't the greatest. The greatest was Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer, but they were from different schools. Rabbi Yeshua was from the Hillel team, and Rabbi Eliezer was from the Shammai team, and they did not agree, and didn't go. And Rabbi Gamliel put his foot down and had none of it. If you are familiar with the stories, Rabbi Eliezer wouldn't back down, and eventually he was kicked out. Shemuti, he became out of the pale. They put him into, excommunicated him, when he was the greatest. But he's the guy, the boss called, came out and said, why are you fighting Rabbi Eliezer? He's right, he's always right, he knows the best. They kicked him out of bounds, out of halachic bounds. He couldn't teach anymore. That's a story we'll get to one day, maybe. Maybe soon in Brachos, actually. And Rabbi Yeshua, who was number two, who came to number one, so to speak. So there's a famous, I'm sure you've heard it, many have heard it, there's the famous Mishnah, really. In Rosh Hashanah, he said, Rabbi Gamliel, what are you doing? It can't be that it's Rosh Chodesh is today, when if you figured out, like, the witnesses make no sense, they're contradicting themselves, and they had a conflicting cheshbon of when Yom Kippur should be. And Rabbi Gamliel said, we are not having this two Torah business in the Jewish people. I insist on your Yom Kippur, because Rabbi Yeshua was a big gun, he was like the biggest gun. You will come, and you will be, so to speak, you will come with your bag in your hand and show up carrying them. You will not be observing publicly any Yom Kippur in your day, because we cannot afford to have two Torahs anymore. And that's what happened. And Rabbi Gamliel, who ruled the Iron Fist, so much so that, as we'll see in the beginning of Brachos, not soon in the beginning of Brachos, that they actually rebelled. They're so not used to his new way of thinking. They rebelled against him for being so iron-fisted. But in any case, the Jewish people post-Chorban only kind of reconvened and settled the score, and they try to make one set of rules all over again to live by, because we couldn't afford the luxury of two Nasek Shtei Toros, like two Torahs. That persisted for 2 generations, let's say. And the Torah Shabbat is still intact. They're resolving the issues once again. It becomes like one Torah. They're Pasuk and Shalas. They still in the Shammai have persisted, but Rabbi Gamliel is trying to get rid of that rift. A nasty guy named Hadrian who was actually influential in this region over here we are, he became emperor. He had this thing for destroying the Jews, so there were nothing but trouble. He came to the region over here. He decided, that's it, enough of these Jews. He set up in the base of English. He set up idols, wanted to make it a temple to Jupiter, and he said no more bris milah and so on. And the Jews revolted. That's the famous Bar Kokhba rebellion, the year 132 of the Common Era. In the beginning, they were winning. They thought it was Mashiach. The Rambam says famously that at least Rabbi Akiva backed him as Mashiach, Bar Kokhba, son of a star, whatever. But by 135, they were totally decimated, and the Jews of Israel were finished in 135. Like that was it. It was just catastrophic. The Gemara makes it sound like billions of Jews died. Whatever the real number was, it was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands, maybe a million Jews were killed in the Bar Kokhba revolt. Happened right here, by the way. If you go up to 375, the last stand, Bar Kokhba's last stand was in his town of Beitar, which is basically Beitar Elite Street. I mean, on the 375, that's where Beitar was. You know, the fourth bracha and Birchas Hamazon, that they were able, the Tova Meitiv, they were able to bury the bodies didn't decompose and they could bury them. Hadrian would let them bury their dead for years. But then they did, and they made a special bracha. Forever, we say it to this day because of the mace, the bodies didn't decompose. That happened in Beitar. The Beitar you pass every day when you go on the back road. And if you go halfway up, there's like you see a sign left that says Chanut. I don't know if you see this little it says Chanut over there. So if you go make a picnic in Chanut, it's very nice. You'll see it says Derech Kesar, the King's Road. And there's a little path, a bike path, a hiking path over there, which takes you basically back down on the 375 back to Beit Shemesh. The King's Road is Hadrian's road. Hadrian built that road to march on Beitar. That's what it was built for. And he did it. And he ultimately destroyed Beitar. And after 135, the Jews were finished. It was looked like it was maybe in a ruchniya sense, the destruction of English was worse. It was worse. But in terms of social, political, demographic sense, the second war of the Jews, the Bar Kokhba revolt and its destruction, its ending, was like much more severe of a blow. And the Jews were basically ostensibly finished. And it looked like pretty much that it was over. It was curtains, really. There was no one left. There was no one left, and there was nothing left, nothing happening. Hashem arranged it that Hadrian took as his adoptive son. The Romans are funny people. They adopted sons as their own and made them like the next emperors if they were their sons. Hadrian adopted a son whose name was Antoninus Pius, and it seems that the next Nasi, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but he happened to have been or managed to be good friends with Antoninus. That was fortuitous, very fortuitous. That was Ashkacha. And the Jews, after Hadrian was off the scene, even though it was disastrous in the wake of the Bar Kokhba revolt, had a break, a respite. In the second half of the 2nd century, let's call it like 175, that kind of time, things were calm for the Jews, and they were okay. The Jews were decimated, but they had an okay living conditions, and they had a window of opportunity. And Rabbi Nasi said, this is the Eis La'asos L'Shem that I mentioned earlier on. It's now or never. If we don't commit our Torah Sheba'al Peh to writing, with a W, writing, then it's gone. It's gonna, the next. I have favor with the emperor, and it was Marcus Aurelius. The next one was not bad either, but it got ugly quick, and the Christians made things worse, and it spun out of control very fast. They were correct. He was correct. Rabbi Nasi. We have to write down something. At least a skeleton of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, so it shouldn't be forgotten. And that he became the person who put together the different versions of these principles that I told you before. If you look at private notes of, he made an authoritative text, which we call the Mishnah. Repetition of those principles, based on Meir's work, who was a Talmud of Rabbi Akiva, based on Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was really the nexus out of which all these books came. So the Mishnah is the Mishnah. There were other texts written around that time, mostly by Rebbe's students. Rebbe was the trailblazer. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is known to us generically as Rebbe, our master. So Rabbi Nasi, or Rebbe, he wrote the Mishnah. His students, like Rav, which was his most important students, Rav wrote the Sefrat Sefrei. His students from Chia wrote the Tosefta, which was like what's called a supplement to the Mishnah. And Osher collected other braisos, like competing versions of these principles. Maybe not for now, really, but we will certainly encounter those other texts, these braisos and Toseftas for short, in the Gemara text. But the authoritative one, which carries a weight to all people, was the Mishnah. the Sanhedrin of its time ratified and authorized the Mishnah as a definitive text, as some kind of skeleton for Torah Shabbat Peh. It seems that Rabbi had an idea. His idea was, how do you write down a text? How do you write down the principles and keep them oral? So he had a clever idea, which was, we'll write something down, but it'll essentially be more or less incomprehensible unless you have some sort of oral tradition to figure it out. In case you have to figure out learning Mishnah, if you just pick up the text and the Mishnah are reading it, you will quickly say, like, what is going on over here? Because that's how it's built. That's what he did. He made it. He set on principles, but they're pretty ambiguous. I don't know if it's the right word. They lend themselves to a lot of ambiguity. Okay, and they require an oral tradition to understand what's going on. That was the design of the Mishnah. That's how you could, have, so to speak, a checklist. We have this 10,000, let's say, I made up a number, 10,000 principles. Here's a checklist that we're going to deal with them because the Mishnah deals with them, brings them up as like an outline, like a notes for a teacher. But the teacher has to get up and explain the principles and sort of exploit them. Hence, our Mishnah here we have in the 9 o'clock. We've been doing that 5.5 years to get through 5 storm, because one Mishnah takes us an hour sometimes, right? That's how it goes. So that was Rabbi's design. But the Mishnah became authoritative as some sort of codification of the principles, at least a shorthand codification of the principles that Moshe Rabbeinu received. After you have that, you have Mikra and you have Mishnah with a capital M. And Mishnah's written down the principles of Torah Shabbat Peh. Talmud remained, what we learned yesterday, the Talmud of yesterday, remained totally, I don't want to say even oral. Talmud isn't a tradition per se. It's each individual thinking about these principles and how they apply and so on, how the principles to do so and so on. What happened was very quickly, because it's built in ambiguity, because there's so many, and because things got worse but better for the Jews, people sort of began to argue over the implications or the meanings of the Mishnahs. Okay? What happened was, Rabbi, let's say, closed the Mishnah, first version of the Mishnah, let's say the year 200, the Common Era. He was in Eretz Yisrael. His leading student, Rav, left Eretz Yisrael in the 3rd century, the 200s, and moved to Bavel. And because it was a wasteland over here in Israel. He moved essentially, like the balance of power shifted. Jews have been in Bavel since Yechezkel had been shifted over there in 597. It's been a long time. But Rav went over there to join Shmuel, who was over there also, and Shmuel and Rav set up. Rav was in Sura and Shmuel was in the Harda. And they had 2 yeshivas over there, and the center of Torah learning shifted from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel. In Eretz Yisrael, you had Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Yochanan realized very quickly that things are spiraling out of control. No one knows how to understand the Mishnayos. Better write something down more to flesh out what the Mishnayos mean. And he created the first Talmud, aka the Talmud Yerushalmi. Rabbi Yochanan, back in Eretz Yisrael, in the, let's say the year 300, I don't know the exact number. No one knows the exact number. Let's say the year 300-ish. He starts putting together the maybe less 250. No, 300, let's say. He starts that kind of time. I think Rosh Hashanah said 200 years after the Churban, 270, whatever it was. He starts putting together a running commentary of the thoughts, the Talmud thoughts that we defined yesterday, on the Mishnayos, on those principles. And he put it together. He started. It took generations to build up this very complex thing called the Talmud Yerushalmi. And that's fine. But what happened was, the leading scholars were not in Eretz Yisrael. The leading scholars had shifted to Bavel. Okay? So even though it was a great idea, and his approach was like his teacher, Rabbi's approach, that we will make a Talmud, but it will still be sort of ambiguous, just less ambiguous. If you learn Yerushalmi, you will see it is very ambiguous. There's not enough word there to make sense of it, just like the Mishnah. And but because the leading scholars of the Jewish people were not in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yochanan's Talmud did not take as the definitive Talmud. What happened was, let's go 100 years later, at some point, if you want to use terms that we define cases, like categories of people up to Hillel and Shammai and Second Temple were called Zugos, the leadership. Then from Hillel and Shammai's students, they were called Tanaim. Okay? Let's say the first 2 centuries, from like say 0 to 200. When Rabbi Yehuda finishes the Mishnah, the age of the Tanaim are over. The Tanaim are the ones who were the ones you see in the Mishnayos. Then there's essentially 300 years of people called Amoraim who are doing the Talmud activity on the Mishnah. Okay? Rabbi Yochanan was a leader, and he was significant, but ultimately not significant enough. And a new Talmud was written in the 5th century, let's say, end of the year 500, by the last Amoraim, Ravina and Rav Ashi. They show prominently, they were students of Rav and Abaya, who feature most prominently of all in the Talmud. And they codified the discussions that had happened over 300 years, the Talmud discussions, lowercase t Talmud defined yesterday, on each of these Mishnayos, each of these topics. And it's quite, as discussions happen, they're quite discursive, they're quite stream of consciousness, they go from topic to topic. But however they, in their wisdom, sought to do it, they wrote an accompanying text which deals with the implications and the principles that govern the Mishnayos. Now, when you want to define the boundaries, the parameters of principles, so the best way to do it is to see just how far you can take it before the principle breaks. And therefore, the Talmud, when we say the Talmud, we mean Talmud Bavli, the collection of discussions, of Talmud, lowercase t discussions, thinking about the principles that were written on the Mishnah. They're typically, it's not about giving ideas, it's not about giving more principles. The principles already were established, the rules were established in the Mishnah already. It's to understand, remember the first step of Talmud, the Rambam said, was to figure out the underlying, to figure out how we got here, from Memory Shiso, how the principles that got us to this Achras, this final point. So if you want to test exactly the principles, the best way to do it is to say, just how far can we take it? And that's what the Talmud tends to do. The Talmud says, okay, we've got a principle, well what about this, and what about that, and what about if we push the envelope to very extreme cases, unusual cases, and weird cases, and what if very weird things happen? The reason why the Talmud does that is not because they have nothing better to do their time, it's that the principles of the Torah are a given. They have no tradition in the Mishnah. If you want to say the exact parameters to define those principles, you need to figure out their exact boundaries. Just how far does this apply before we've gone over the line? And therefore the Talmud spends its time, a great deal of time, asking what seems to be really strange and far out and highly unlikely scenario questions. That's because Talmud is not about establishing the principles of the Torah in terms of the list of rules. It's about understanding those rules. It's not about your understanding. Let me restate that point. I think it's so important. The Talmud is not there to tell you the facts. The facts are given in the Mishnah. It's to say what are the implications or the underlying principles or derivations of those facts. And therefore, the Talmud discusses things that are often counterfactual or doesn't care about the facts as per se. It wants to say we have rules, a rules-based system called the Torah, given in the Mishnah. How are these rules? How far can we take them? How do they apply? When do they apply? What to do if they seem to come into contradiction with one another? And therefore, the Talmud is not telling you information. I want to emphasize that. We said Talmud lowercase t yesterday is not about information at all. It's about thinking about the information. The Talmud is a collection of 10,000-page collection of discussions, of ruminating and thinking and cogitating and pondering over, doing the act Talmud lowercase t on these principles. Therefore, if you want to learn what the Torah has to say, if you ask me, the Talmud capital T, is a terrible place to go. Because that's not its agenda. Its agenda is, once you know the principles that give in the Mishnah and the Psukim, so exactly what are the parameters, exactly how many take, what are the underlying principles, let's try to dig them out. When you try to dig the underlying principles, sometimes you come up with, 13 and negative 13. Sometimes you get the contradiction. And then you have machlokas. Machlokas, proliferates in terms of underlying principles, not typically in terms of dinim. Not in terms of dinim. Very important point, right? The dinim were given, but the underlying principles are how far you take them. Extrapolation, is a microwave cooking on Shabbos, then you start to have a discussion about it, right? Because it's not clear which rules you apply and how you apply them. And that's what Talmud is doing. So, the reason why the rabbis called Rina Ravashi, or whatever he named it, the Talmud Bavli, the same word synonymous with Talmud, the action of thinking about things, because that's what it is. It's a collection of discussions that happened over 300 years, weighted towards the end. That's where Abai and Rav are the most common players, because they were the teachers of the final editors of Rina Ravashi. But 300 years of discussions about those principles. And that's what the Talmud is. We actually have a number of terms I want to clarify quickly here. Okay? I'll differentiate between 4 terms here. I will write them in English because I can use the lowercase as it lowercase t? Do I do that thing? Oh no, someone called me now. I'm recording that. Hold on. Okay, disaster. What a shame. I didn't think. What a shame. Airplane. Okay, we'll keep it. Yeah, airplane on. Okay, so lowercase t Talmud, capital T Talmud. There's some, I'll write in Hebrew also. Shas, we have Gemara. I'll write them in Hebrew too. What is the difference between these two? This is Gemara, this is Shas, this is Talmud Bavli, this is Talmud. So these are not the same thing, okay? I want to define them for you now. Talmud lowercase t, Talmud for yesterday, is thinking about the principles. It's an action that you do, an activity you do, working on the transmission of the tradition. Talmud capital T, or Talmud Bavli, is a collection of those discussions. But the truth is, the Talmud is comprised of two texts, two documents. One is called the Mishnah, we discussed that before. And then on every Mishnah, there's a collection of these Talmudic discussions, Talmudic lowercase t discussions, called the Gemara. Okay? So the Talmud actually is the Talmud, capital T, Talmud Bavli, is actually two texts. It's the Mishnah text and the Gemara text. The Gemara is the 300 years of discussions after the Mishnah was written. Say the year 500 was edited, and it went on for a while. And the Mishnah is like around 200, year 200 of the Common Era. Two texts. This is Rabbi Nassi's, 200 CE. This is Rabbi Yehuda Nassi, I don't know. See? And the Gemara is 500 CE, roughly. Round numbers good enough for us. This is Ravina and Rashi. And Marbar, Rashi, whatever. It didn't end in a day. It didn't end in a generation or even 100 years. It kept on getting ironed out for a long time. So that's the Mishnah Gemara. And then, well, erase down. I don't know what this is. That's Talmud Bavli, two texts. Shas is an abbreviation. It stands for Shishe Sidra, 6 orders, 6 Siddharim, a reference to the Mishnah, which was divided into 6 macro sections: Zroim, Moed, Nashim, Hazikim, Pachim, and Taharos. These 6 orders. Shishe. 6 orders. Now, Shas is 6 orders. There, in the time of Chazal, there were 60 Masechtos. The Siddharim divided into Masechtos, which there are 60 of them. In our current count, if you count them off the shelf today, if you open, say, your Mishnayos, look at the inside cover, and start counting, you'll get to 63. Okay, that's basically because, if I get this topic too complex to think today, that originally Bava Kama, Bava Mitzim, Bava Basra were single Masechta, called the Zikin, so that adds 2. 1 became 3, adds 2. And also it seems that Sanhedrin and Makos were combined and separated. So you get 2 more. Okay, you get one more from there. In any case, our Talmud Bavli does not discuss all 60 or 63 Masechtas. It only discusses 36. And it's not totally complete even because so you could argue 35, let's say 36. There are 36 Masechtas of the 63 in Shas, in the Mishnah. Only 36 have Bavli on them. Exactly why and what happened and were there others that were lost, let's say no. It's conjectural. Let's assume that we have nothing got lost. Let's assume. It's unknown. It's a little strange, like why it would be that they just decided not to write a Bavli on Shkolim, for example, like where's the Bavli on Shkolim? It's so strange. But maybe, who knows. There is no, the Yerushalmi, they did Zeraim. There is no, except for Brachos, there are no Bavli Gemaras on Seder Zeraim, except for Brachos. The Yerushalmi does. The Bavli deals with Kachim. The Yerushalmi seems doesn't. We don't have Kachim on Yerushalmi. And Taharos basically was left all alone. There are no Yerushalmis on Taharos. There's no Bavli in Taharos, say for one Masechta Nida. It could be argued that the reason why, and this is for sure, or reason why it played out this way, that without a Beis Hamikdash in the year 500, so there's no need to worry too much about Taharos or about Kachim, but Zerah, out of Eretz Yisrael, so they just didn't deal with those topics. Could will be. Okay, Zera'im or it's a Tluis Ba'aretz need to be having Eretz Yisrael. Interestingly, we're back there today, so it's come back into being relevant. In any case, so the text we're going to learn is the Talmud Bavli, which will be the Gemara part, the discussions, those Talmud discussions. The last time the Sanhedrin met was the year 358 of the Common Era, I believe, 359, 358, I think, in my head. So that's before this happens. It's basically the end of the time Yerushalmi is closed, there's no more Sanhedrin, and by the Bavli there's no Sanhedrin. So the end of Hora'ah, as I'll talk about it, the end of setting, definitive opinions of these principles that the Torah were given, is closed with the Gemara. The Gemara, the Shas Bavli, which is the primary and has pride of place over the Yerushalmi, because it was second, and the thinking is that if it was second, they had the opportunity to review and consider Yerushalmi and yet overrule it, let's say. So the Bavli is authoritative, and it's the last time that anything really is, so to speak, binding on the entire Jewish people. There's no real literature after the Bavli for a long time. The next time, the only literature you have in the Jewish library after the Bavli shows up like many hundreds of years later, essentially, and it's just Shalos and Shuvas, questions and answers that were sent to the Gaonim of Bavel, Gaon, Gematria 60, because they were masters of the 16 Masechtas. They say, but in any case, the Gaonim were the heads of the yeshivas in Bavel, and that's it. Not until the Rishonim, it's called the year 1000, Rabbeinu Hanan, Rabbeinu Gershom, who arguably the last Gaonim or first of Rishonim, whatever they were, do people start writing again, and their literature is essentially a commentary, an explanation of the Gemara text, because apparently 5 years later, even the Gemara became too close to really understand, hence Rashi helped us through it. But what they say, you're well aware that by the year 1000, by the year 1038, if you care, Jews were essentially out of Bavel, and it's scattered. There were what would become two sets of Jews, so to speak. There are actually many subsets, but Sparta and Ashkenazim were two major groups. At the time it was all Sparta, basically, but the few Jews ended up in France and Germany, which became a significant group. And they went their separate ways, halachically, and then you're well aware that Nasa Kashtei Toros again. Unfortunately, what's definitive is the Gemara, and after that it's a bit of like would be probably overstepping the truth to say a free-for-all, but it's as long as what you can say, you being the posek or the dayan, is defensible by what the Gemara says, and then subsequently by what the Rishonim say in their explanation of the Gemara, no one can say you're wrong. You'd have to show why you're wrong in your explanation or understanding of the text itself. Before that, the Gemara people had different opinions. They could build their own edifices and have different approaches and have machlokas, which they did. But we do not do that. Gemara is the closing, the Jewish opinion, essentially until Mashiach comes, at least until Sanhedrin reconvene, which probably is the same thing. But the Gemara says stands, and that's the final definitive set of rules by which we have to play. So when you have Rishonim saying stuff, they have to basically embed it in their understanding of the Gemara, and subsequent people down to today will be based, their rulings, etc., and Hashkaf, everything will be based on the Gemaras and the Rishonim on it. So basically we'll have to stop there, but at least before I let you go, if the question was, what is Talmud and why do we learn it, I hope at least now we've addressed that in a satisfactory way. So,
That's right.